What is the meaning of this?
You know exactly what this means, Edward.
No, I don't.
How dare you touch her piano? The words cracked through the mansion like thunder against stained glass, sharp enough to silence every conversation in the room. Naomi Brooks jerked her hands away from the ivory keys as the final trembling note of Chopin faded into the air. Crystal chandeliers shimmered overhead, casting golden reflections across the polished black Steinway that sat in the center of Edward Sinclair's private music room like a sacred monument nobody was allowed to approach. The billionaire stood frozen in the doorway, his silver cufflinks catching the light as rage tightened every line of his face. Around him, wealthy guests in tailored suits and silk gowns slowly turned toward Naomi with expressions that shifted from surprise to quiet disgust. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Naomi stood beside the piano in her dark housekeeping uniform, a dust cloth still hanging from one hand, her chest rising carefully as if even breathing too loudly might get her thrown out of the estate. Outside the 20-foot windows, rain streaked down the glass overlooking the cliffs of Lake Michigan, the storm muting the city lights below. Edward stepped forward slowly, his expensive shoes echoing against the marble floor. "That piano belonged to my wife," he said coldly. "No staff member touches it. Ever." Naomi lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry, sir. I was only cleaning." A woman near the fireplace let out a quiet laugh behind her champagne glass. Cleaning doesn't usually involve playing Chopin. A few guests smiled under their breath. Naomi felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she stayed silent. She had learned years ago that silence often protected dignity better than anger ever could. Edward's jaw tightened as he looked toward the untouched whiskey sitting beside the piano bench. For 5 years, nobody had played that instrument. Not since Evelyn Sinclair died unexpectedly during a winter gala in New York. Since then, the room had become more shrine than music room. Guests admired it. Employees dusted around it. But nobody touched the keys. Until tonight. Edward walked closer, his voice lower now, somehow colder. "Do you even know what you were playing?" Naomi swallowed. Carefully. Ballade number 1 in G minor. The room went still again. One older guest near the bookshelves blinked in surprise. Edward's eyes narrowed slightly. And where exactly would a maid learn that? The question landed harder than the insult hidden inside it. Naomi looked down at her gloved hands. The white fabric around her fingers was worn thin from years of chemicals and polishing silver trays. But underneath those gloves were calluses that had nothing to do with cleaning. Before she could answer, another guest smirked and muttered, "Probably watched it on YouTube." Soft laughter followed. Naomi felt every pair of eyes on her now, measuring her, reducing her, deciding exactly who they believed she was. Edward extended his hand toward the piano bench. "Step away from it." Naomi nodded once and moved carefully aside. But as Edward reached to close the piano lid, his eyes stopped suddenly on the sheet music resting above the keys. One page had shifted. A handwritten note was circled in faded blue ink. His expression changed instantly. Slowly, almost unwillingly, he looked back at Naomi. "Who finished this passage?" he asked quietly. Naomi hesitated. Then, barely above a whisper, she answered, "Your wife did, but she never got to play it the way she wanted." The question settled over the room heavier than the storm outside. Naomi could hear the soft crackle of firewood from the marble fireplace and the faint ticking of the antique clock near the staircase, but nobody answered for her. Edward Sinclair stood inches from the piano now, staring at the handwritten notes on the page as though they had reached out and touched something buried deep inside him. His guests exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether this had become entertainment or something far more personal. Naomi kept her posture straight even while her pulse hammered beneath her uniform collar. "What do you mean she never got to play it the way she wanted?" Edward asked quietly. The anger in his voice had faded, replaced by something sharper. Something dangerous because it sounded almost vulnerable. Naomi hesitated. She should have stopped talking. Every instinct told her that. People like Edward. Sinclair did not appreciate strangers stepping into their grief, especially not someone paid $18 an hour to polish mirrors and vacuum imported rugs. But the unfinished melody sitting on that page felt too familiar. Your wife changed the ending, Naomi said carefully. She crossed out the original transition. Edward's eyes flicked toward her instantly. One of the older men near the bookshelf frowned. How could you possibly know that? Naomi looked toward the piano again. Because the phrasing shifts too early. She wanted the final section softer. Less technical. More human. Silence. Thick and immediate. A woman standing beside the grand staircase slowly lowered her wine glass. Edward stared at Naomi like he was trying to place her somewhere impossible. Then his expression hardened again, retreating behind the cold discipline that had made him one of the most feared men on Wall Street. Who are you? He asked. Naomi opened her mouth, then closed it again. The answer felt too large for this room. Too complicated for people who had already decided what they saw when they looked at her. Just a maid. Just another invisible employee moving quietly through million-dollar hallways. Finally, she said, my mother cleaned houses in Southside Chicago for 23 years. I started working when I was 16. Several guests nodded faintly, as if that confirmed everything they already believed. But Edward kept staring. That is not what I asked. Naomi slowly removed one glove, then the other. Soft murmurs spread immediately through the room as her fingertips caught the chandelier light. The skin was rough beneath her nails, hardened by years of repetition against piano keys. Not the hands of someone who had merely dusted instruments. Edward noticed it too. His gaze lowered for only a second before returning to her face. You trained professionally, he said. It was not a question anymore. Naomi swallowed. A long time ago. Rain battered the windows harder now, wind curling against the glass overlooking the lake nearly 40 feet below the cliffside estate. Somewhere deeper in the mansion, a violin recording drifted faintly through hidden speakers before. Abruptly cutting off, Edward reached toward the piano bench and slowly sat down for the first time all evening. The movement alone startled the room. Billionaires did not sit beside maids at formal parties. They especially did not look at them with curiosity. What was your name again? He asked. Naomi Brooks. Edward nodded once, eyes drifting back toward the unfinished notes. Evelyn spent 6 months rewriting this ending before she died, he said softly. Nobody else knew that. Naomi felt something tighten painfully in her chest. Because she remembered hearing this exact version years ago through the half-open practice room door at Juilliard, while a guest instructor whispered that genius sounded less like perfection and more like honesty. She should not have recognized it. And yet she had. Edward rested one hand against the piano keys without pressing them. Play the ending, he said quietly. Several guests looked shocked. One man even laughed nervously. Edward, surely you are not serious. But Edward never looked away from Naomi. Play it, he repeated. Exactly the way you believe my wife intended. Naomi stood perfectly still while every eye in the room locked onto her. The rain outside rolled against the massive windows in slow silver streams, and somewhere above the fireplace the crystal chandelier hummed faintly with electricity. Nobody touched their drinks now. Nobody whispered. The entire mansion felt suspended inside one impossible moment. Edward Sinclair remained seated at the piano bench, one hand resting lightly against the polished black surface of the Steinway, as though he suddenly feared the instrument less than the silence surrounding it. Well? One guest finally muttered near the back of the room. Play it. Naomi looked down at the piano keys. The ivory reflected softly beneath the chandelier light, worn slightly near middle C from decades of use. She had not touched a grand piano in almost 4 years. Not a real one. Certainly not one worth more than most homes in Chicago. Her throat tightened. Sir, she said carefully, I do not think this is appropriate. I did not ask what you think is appropriate. Edward's voice remained calm. Now, but the weight inside it silenced the room all over again. Naomi slowly inhaled through her nose. She could smell lemon oil from the freshly polished wood mixed with cigar smoke and expensive perfume drifting through the mansion. Her fingers trembled slightly as she stepped toward the bench. One of the women near the staircase folded her arms. This is ridiculous, she whispered to her husband. Next we will have chauffeurs conducting orchestras. Naomi heard it. Of course she did. Years of cleaning wealthy homes had taught her that rich people often spoke about workers as though they could not hear. But she kept walking anyway. Edward shifted slightly aside, giving her room at the bench. That movement alone sent another ripple through the crowd. Naomi sat carefully at the edge of the leather seat. The piano felt cold beneath her fingertips. Familiar. Dangerous. She closed her eyes for one brief second, and suddenly she was 17 again in a practice room at Juilliard, hearing instructors pace behind rows of students while snow drifted past narrow Manhattan windows. Technique means nothing if the audience cannot feel your truth. Her old piano professor used to repeat those words until students hated hearing them. Naomi had believed them anyway. Slowly she opened her eyes again. Edward watched her carefully now, no longer like a maid who had crossed a line, but like someone holding a key to a locked room he had not entered in years. "How did you know Evelyn changed the transition?" he asked quietly. Naomi kept her eyes on the keys. "Because she used hesitation instead of control." Edward frowned faintly. "What does that mean?" Naomi pressed one single note gently into the silence. "Soft. Fragile. Most pianists play the ending like they are trying to impress the audience," she said. "Your wife played it like she was speaking to someone she loved." The room fell still again. Even the guests who had mocked her earlier said nothing now. Edward's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, like something inside him had cracked open just enough to let memory through. Naomi lowered her hands to the keyboard fully now. The white sleeves of her housekeeping uniform brushed lightly against the polished edge of the Steinway. For a moment she hesitated, not because she was afraid of failing, but because she understood exactly what this music meant to the man beside her. This was not just a song. It was grief preserved in black lacquer and ivory. Then Naomi began to play. The first notes drifted through the mansion like candlelight moving through darkness, soft enough that several guests unconsciously leaned closer just to hear. Edward's breathing changed immediately, barely noticeable, but Naomi heard it. Because the melody she played was not perfect in the way rich audiences usually admired. It breathed. It ached. It lingered where it hurt. And halfway through the unfinished passage, Edward suddenly gripped the edge of the piano so tightly his wedding ring struck the wood with a quiet metallic click. The sound of the piano moved through the mansion slowly at first, almost cautiously, like someone reopening a door that had stayed locked for too many years. Naomi's fingers glided across the ivory keys with a softness that made the room feel smaller, quieter, more honest. Nobody touched their drinks anymore. The crackling fireplace, the distant thunder outside, even the clinking ice inside crystal glasses had disappeared beneath the music. Edward Sinclair sat beside her completely motionless, his hand still gripping the edge of the Steinway, so tightly the veins near his wrist had turned pale beneath the skin. Then Naomi reached the unfinished transition. The melody slowed, hesitated, breathed. Her left hand lingered over the lower register while the right carried the final phrase upward so gently it almost sounded fragile. Edward's eyes widened instantly. "No," he whispered under his breath. Several guests exchanged confused looks, but Naomi kept playing. Because she understood now. Evelyn Sinclair had not rewritten the ending to impress an audience. She rewrote it because she was dying. Naomi could hear it hidden between the pauses and softened tempo. The piece no longer fought against silence. It accepted it, and somehow that made it beautiful. Edward suddenly stood up from the bench and stepped backward as though the music itself had struck him somewhere deep inside his chest. One of the guests moved toward him immediately. "Edward, are you all right?" But he did not answer. His eyes never left Naomi's hands. The final notes drifted into the air slowly, hanging beneath the chandelier light before dissolving into silence. Nobody clapped. Nobody breathed. Naomi lowered her hands carefully into her lap, staring down at the keys as if afraid to look at anyone. Then Edward spoke. She played it exactly like that the night before she died. His voice sounded distant now, unsteady. The room remained frozen. A woman near the fireplace frowned softly. "That is impossible." Edward ignored her. He walked slowly toward the piano again, each polished step echoing across the marble floor. "I never published that arrangement," he said quietly. "Nobody heard it except me." Naomi finally looked up at him. The grief in his face no longer resembled anger. It looked older than that. Tired. "I did not know it was hers," Naomi admitted softly. "I only recognized the emotion." Edward stared at her for several long seconds. Then his gaze dropped again to her hands. "You said you trained professionally. he said. Where? Naomi hesitated. The room suddenly felt too warm beneath the chandelier lights. Too exposed. Juilliard, she answered quietly. The reaction was immediate. One man nearly choked on his drink. Another guest blinked in disbelief. Juilliard, someone repeated. You were telling me the maid went to Juilliard? Naomi felt the familiar sting behind the words. Not surprise. Disbelief. The kind reserved for people society never expected to carry brilliance inside them. Edward noticed it too. Slowly, he turned toward the guests lining the room. She is more educated in music than half the people standing here, he said coldly. Silence followed immediately. Naomi looked at him in surprise. The billionaire who had humiliated her less than 20 minutes ago was now defending her in front of the same people who laughed when she sat at the piano. Edward turned back toward her again. Why did you leave? He asked quietly. Naomi lowered her eyes to the keys once more. The polished black surface reflected faint traces of chandelier light across her face. Because scholarships do not pay hospital bills, she answered softly. Nobody spoke after that. Somewhere outside, thunder rolled across Lake Michigan while rain battered the windows in silver waves. Edward looked at the unfinished sheet music resting above the piano, then back at Naomi. And for the first time all evening, he no longer saw a maid sitting at his wife's piano. He saw someone who understood loss almost as deeply as he did. The room never fully recovered from the silence after Naomi's answer. Scholarships do not pay hospital bills. The words lingered beneath the chandelier light heavier than the Chopin melody, still echoing faintly through everyone's memory. Several guests suddenly avoided looking directly at her, as though recognizing humanity in someone they had dismissed all evening made them uncomfortable. Edward Sinclair stood beside the piano without speaking, one hand resting against the polished edge while rain rolled endlessly beyond the towering windows overlooking the lake. The storm had grown stronger now. Wind rattled the glass softly, and distant thunder vibrated through the mansion floor like a slow heartbeat. Naomi carefully slipped her gloves back over her hands, hiding the calluses once more beneath white fabric. It was instinct. Protection. Years ago, she learned the world respected uniforms more than talent when talent came from the wrong person. Your mother is sick? Edward finally asked quietly. Naomi nodded once. Kidney failure. Edward's jaw tightened slightly. And you left Juilliard to care for her. There was nobody else. One older guest near the fireplace cleared his throat awkwardly. Well, he muttered, forcing a smile that fooled no one. Life takes unexpected turns. Naomi recognized the tone immediately. The polite version of pity rich people used when they wanted to feel compassionate without actually feeling uncomfortable. She lowered her eyes politely and said nothing. Edward noticed that too. His gaze shifted slowly across the room toward the guests who had mocked her earlier. The same people who praised art every weekend but almost failed to recognize it. Standing directly in front of them because it wore a housekeeping uniform. Leave us, Edward said suddenly. Several guests blinked in surprise. Edward. One woman laughed nervously. Surely the party is not over because of a piano performance. Edward turned toward her calmly, but the coldness in his eyes made her smile disappear immediately. I said leave us. Nobody argued after that. One by one, the guests gathered their coats and unfinished drinks in uneasy silence. High heels clicked across marble. Soft apologies drifted awkwardly through the room. A man near the staircase gave Naomi one final confused look before disappearing into the hallway beside the others. Within minutes, the massive music room felt completely different. Empty. Honest. The fire crackled softly in the marble hearth while rain continued tracing silver lines across the dark windows. Naomi stood slowly from the piano bench. I should get back to work, she said quietly. Edward looked at her for a long moment before answering. No. The single word caught her off guard. Edward walked toward the fireplace now, loosening his tie slightly, as though the evening had suddenly become exhausting. Do you know what everyone saw when you sat at that piano tonight? Naomi remained silent. A surprise, he answered for her. Something unusual, entertaining. His voice carried bitterness now, but not toward her. Toward himself. Toward the room full of people who claimed to love beauty while reducing human beings into categories the moment they walked through a door. Edward stared into the flames quietly. Evelyn hated rooms like this, he admitted softly. Naomi looked at him in surprise. She said wealthy people only listened to music so they could applaud themselves afterward. A faint smile almost touched his face before disappearing again. I used to think she was exaggerating. Naomi glanced toward the piano. She sounded like a wise woman. Edward nodded once. She would have liked you. The words settled gently between them. Naomi suddenly felt something dangerous rising inside her chest. Not attraction, not comfort, recognition. The painful understanding that grief could make strangers feel familiar in ways happiness never could. Edward turned back toward the unfinished sheet music resting above the Steinway. There is something I do not understand, he said quietly. How did you hear her intentions so clearly? Naomi hesitated. The firelight reflected softly against her eyes now. Then, after several long seconds, she answered in almost a whisper. Because my father used to play exactly the same way before cancer took his hands from him. Edward looked at her sharply. Naomi lowered her gaze again. Sometimes people stop trying to sound perfect when they know time is running out. The fire burned lower as midnight crept deeper into the mansion, casting slow amber light across the marble walls and polished wood shelves lined with first edition scores and framed photographs. Rain still tapped against the towering windows overlooking Lake Michigan, softer now, almost rhythmic, like the storm itself had grown tired. Naomi stood near the piano with her gloves folded carefully in her hands while Edward Sinclair remained by the fireplace, staring into the flames without speaking. The silence between them no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt fragile, honest in a way neither of them seemed fully prepared for. Edward loosened his collar slightly and glanced toward the framed portrait resting above the mantel. Evelyn Sinclair smiled down from the photograph in a black velvet concert dress, one hand resting lightly against the very same Steinway, now sitting silent in the middle of the room. She used to play every night after dinner, Edward said quietly, even when she was exhausted. Naomi followed his gaze to the portrait. People like your wife do not play because they want applause, she said softly. They play because silence hurts too much. Edward looked at her sharply, surprised by how quickly she understood something he had spent years failing to explain to anyone else. The billionaire exhaled slowly and walked toward a small crystal decanter resting beside the bookshelf. He poured himself a drink, but never touched it. After she died, he admitted quietly, I closed this room for almost 5 years. Naomi looked down at the piano keys. A thin layer of fresh polish still shimmered beneath the chandelier light where her cloth had passed earlier that evening. Grief makes people protect strange things, she said. Edward gave a faint nod. I thought if nobody touched the piano, then somehow I was protecting her memory. Naomi's eyes softened slightly. But music dies when nobody hears it. The words settled into the room gently, heavier than either of them expected. Edward stared at the untouched glass in his hand. Somewhere deep inside the mansion, the grandfather clock chimed once, low and distant. Naomi glanced toward the doorway instinctively. It was late. She still had another hallway to clean before sunrise, and her bus ride back to the South Side apartment would take nearly 90 minutes in the rain. But something kept her standing there. Maybe it was the piano. Maybe it was the strange sadness in Edward's eyes now that the anger was finally gone. Edward suddenly walked toward the bookshelf and pulled open a narrow drawer hidden beneath a stack of old sheet music. From inside, he removed a faded program booklet with worn gold lettering along the edge. He stared at it silently before holding it out toward Naomi. Do you remember this? Naomi took it carefully. The moment she saw the logo printed across the front, her breath caught. Juilliard Winter Showcase, 2017. Her fingers tightened slightly around the paper. Edward noticed immediately. You performed there, he said quietly. Naomi swallowed hard. Only once. Edward stepped closer. Evelyn attended that showcase with me. Naomi slowly lifted her eyes toward him. What? Edward nodded faintly. There was a young pianist that night she could not stop talking about afterward. Naomi stared at him in disbelief while the rain whispered softly against the windows behind them. Edward looked down at the program again before reading aloud quietly. Naomi Brooks. Original interpretation praised for emotional restraint beyond her years. Naomi felt heat rise suddenly into her face. She had not heard those words in almost a decade. Not since before hospital bills replaced auditions. Before overnight cleaning shifts replaced practice rooms. Edward looked at her carefully now, almost painfully aware of what he had done earlier that night. How quickly he reduced her into a uniform. "I humiliated someone my wife once admired," he said softly. Naomi lowered her eyes again, but there was no bitterness in her voice when she answered. "No, sir. You only saw what the world taught you to see first." Naomi stood frozen beside the piano, the worn Juilliard program still resting lightly between her fingers while the fire crackled low behind them. Outside, the storm had finally begun to weaken. Rain slid slowly down the towering windows overlooking the dark water of Lake Michigan, and somewhere beyond the cliffs a distant foghorn echoed through the night. The mansion no longer felt cold. It felt exposed, as though years of silence had finally been pulled back from the walls one painful inch at a time. Edward Sinclair stared at Naomi with an expression she could not fully read anymore. The arrogance from earlier that evening was gone completely now. What remained looked closer to regret. Deep regret. "Evelyn came home after that performance and talked about you for 2 straight hours, he said quietly. Naomi blinked in surprise. Edward gave a faint shake of his head, almost at himself. "She said there was a young pianist who played like she understood loneliness before life had even introduced itself properly." Naomi looked away quickly. Hearing those words hurt more than she expected, because there had been a time when people spoke about her future instead of her survival. A time when professors discussed concert halls instead of hourly wages. Edward stepped closer to the piano and carefully touched the edge of the old program in Naomi's hand. "Why did you never return?" Naomi's throat tightened slightly. "After my father died, my mother got sick 6 months later. The medical bills started piling up. I picked up night shifts at a grocery store while still practicing, but eventually," she stopped herself softly. Edward finished the sentence for her. "Eventually life became more expensive than talent." Naomi gave a faint nod. Silence settled between them again. But this silence no longer carried shame. It carried understanding. Edward slowly sat down at the piano bench once more, staring at the unfinished sheet music resting beneath the chandelier light. "You know what bothers me most?" he asked quietly. Naomi looked at him. "I built an entire foundation for young musicians after Evelyn died. Scholarships, international competitions, private conservatories." His jaw tightened faintly. "And somehow the woman standing 10 feet away from me tonight still ended up cleaning my floors instead of performing on my stage." Naomi looked down at her gloves. "That is not your fault." Edward let out a humorless laugh. "Maybe not directly." He rested both hands against the piano keys without pressing them. "But men like me created rooms where people like you have to fight twice as hard just to be noticed once." Naomi studied him carefully. Powerful people rarely admitted truths that uncomfortable out loud. Especially not about race. Especially not about class. Edward looked up toward her again, his expression quieter now. "When I walked into this room tonight," he admitted softly, "I did not see a musician sitting at my piano." Naomi said nothing. She did not need him to finish the sentence. Edward's eyes drifted toward the mansion hallway where his wealthy guests had disappeared earlier. "I saw a Blackmaid breaking rules in a room she did not belong in." The honesty landed heavily between them. Naomi slowly folded the Juilliard program closed. "And now?" she asked quietly. Edward looked toward the portrait above the fireplace again. Evelyn's smile watched over the room in silent stillness. "Now," he said slowly, "I think my wife would have been ashamed of me tonight." Naomi's expression softened immediately. "No," she answered gently. "She would have been disappointed. There is a difference." Edward stared at her for several seconds after that. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. Small, tired, real. It was probably the first genuine smile Naomi had seen from him all evening. Edward reached toward the piano and lightly pressed a single key, letting the note hum quietly through the room. "Tomorrow night," he said carefully, "the Chicago Philharmonic performs here for the Sinclair Foundation Gala." Naomi frowned slightly, unsure where he was going. Edward looked directly at her now. "Our guest soloist canceled this morning because of a medical emergency." Naomi's breath caught instantly. Edward's voice remained calm, but there was something almost hopeful hidden beneath it now. "I would like you to take her place." For a moment Naomi thought she had misunderstood him. The fire crackled softly behind them while rain whispered against the mansion windows, and the enormous music room suddenly felt too still to breathe inside. Edward Sinclair remained seated at the piano bench, watching her carefully, waiting for an answer that Naomi could not seem to find. "Sir," she said quietly, "I clean hallways for your foundation." Edward gave a faint shake of his head. "No," he replied softly. "Tonight you reminded me why the foundation was created in the first place." Naomi lowered her eyes immediately. Fear crept into her chest before hope could. Hope was more dangerous. Hope was what made people leave stable jobs chasing futures that sometimes never arrived. "I have not performed publicly in years," she admitted. "Then perhaps it is time the world heard you again." Naomi turned away slightly, clutching her gloves tighter between her fingers. The idea alone felt impossible. Tomorrow night the mansion would be filled with investors, politicians, philanthropists, critics, and reporters from every major arts publication in Chicago. People who belonged in rooms like this. People who would stare the moment they realized the evening soloist was the same Blackmaid who cleaned silver trays 2 floors below them. Edward seemed to understand every fear crossing her face. "You do not owe me an answer tonight," he said carefully. "But I would regret staying silent after hearing what I heard." Naomi looked back toward the Steinway. The chandelier light shimmered across the piano lid like water. For years she had trained herself not to miss music too much. She worked double shifts, rode crowded buses before sunrise, measured groceries carefully so her mother's prescriptions could still be paid on time. Survival left little room for dreaming. But sitting at that piano earlier had reopened something she thought life already buried. Edward slowly stood from the bench and walked toward the portrait above the fireplace. He stared at Evelyn's photograph quietly before speaking again. "The last conversation my wife and I ever had about music was an argument." Naomi frowned softly. Edward smiled faintly at the memory, though sadness still weighed heavily behind it. "She told me talent is one of the only sacred things in this world because it does not care about race, money, or status." His gaze lowered toward the floor. "I told her talent still needed opportunity." Naomi listened silently. Edward looked back toward her now. "Tonight, I realized we were both right." The room fell quiet again. Somewhere upstairs, wind rattled softly through the old chimney vents while the grandfather clock marked another passing minute. Naomi slowly walked toward the piano once more, her fingertips brushing lightly across the polished wood. "When I left school," she said softly, "my professor told me something before my final train back to Chicago." Edward listened carefully. "He said there are people who stop playing because they lose talent," Naomi continued. "And there are people who stop because the world convinces them survival matters more." Her reflection shimmered faintly in the black lacquer surface of the Steinway. Older now, more tired, but still there. Edward's voice lowered almost to a whisper. "And which one are you?" Naomi looked down at her gloved hands for several seconds before answering. "I do not know anymore." Edward stepped closer, stopping beside the piano bench where she had played earlier that evening. "Then let tomorrow answer it for you." Naomi felt emotion rise suddenly into her throat, sharp and unexpected. Not because of the invitation itself, but because this was the first time in years someone looked at her and saw possibility instead of limitation. Edward reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and removed a cream-colored envelope embossed with the Sinclair Foundation seal. He placed it gently on top of the piano keys. "Your name is already printed in tomorrow night's revised program." Naomi stared at the envelope in shock. Edward gave a faint, tired smile. "I had my assistant update it 20 minutes ago." Naomi looked up at him speechless. Edward glanced once more toward Evelyn's portrait above the fireplace before speaking softly into the quiet room. "My wife spent her life searching for music that sounded honest." His eyes returned to Naomi. "Tonight, I think she finally found it again." The following evening, the Sinclair mansion glowed against the shoreline like a palace of gold and glass rising above the dark waters of Lake Michigan. Black sedans lined the circular driveway while guests in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos climbed the marble steps beneath soft snowfall drifting through the Chicago night. Inside, the grand ballroom shimmered beneath towering chandeliers, every table dressed in white roses and candlelight for the Sinclair Foundation Gala. Reporters gathered near the stage whispering about the last-minute program change while members of the Chicago Philharmonic tuned their instruments beneath the soft murmur of the crowd. Backstage, Naomi Brooks stood alone beside a velvet curtain, staring down at the cream-colored program, trembling lightly between her fingers. Her name sat printed in elegant gold lettering beneath the words guest soloist. For several seconds, she simply stared at it, unable to fully believe it was real. Her black concert gown was simple compared to the designer dresses filling the ballroom outside, but it fit her with quiet grace. She had borrowed it from one of the foundation stylists only an hour earlier after Edward insisted she deserved to walk on stage as herself and not as someone hiding behind a uniform. Naomi touched the fabric nervously. It had been years since she wore anything that was not practical. Years since anyone prepared a room expecting her arrival instead of her labor. Through the curtain, she could hear hundreds of voices softening as Edward Sinclair stepped onto the ballroom stage. "Good evening," his voice echoed calmly through the hall. Naomi closed her eyes briefly, steadying her breathing the same way her father taught her when she was 9 years old, sitting beside an old, upright piano in their tiny apartment. "One breath in, one breath out," Edward continued speaking. The Sinclair Foundation was created to support gifted young artists whose circumstances threatened to silence them. His voice paused slightly. "Tonight, I realized that mission failed someone standing much closer to me than I ever bothered to notice." Soft murmurs moved through the ballroom. Naomi felt emotion tighten in her chest. Edward's voice lowered gently now. "Last night, someone reminded me that talent does not disappear because life becomes difficult. Sometimes it simply waits for someone to listen again." Then he turned toward the curtain. "Ladies and gentlemen, Miss Naomi Brooks." The ballroom fell completely silent as Naomi stepped into the light. Hundreds of eyes turned toward her instantly. Some recognized her immediately from the mansion staff. A few whispered in confusion. Others stared openly. But Naomi kept walking anyway. The stage lights felt warm against her skin as she crossed toward the Steinway, waiting at center stage beneath the chandeliers. Edward stood nearby watching her with quiet respect, no longer as an employer looking at an employee, but as one human being recognizing another. Naomi sat at the piano bench slowly. Her fingers hovered above the keys while the orchestra behind her waited. For one terrifying second, fear returned. The years away from music. The bus rides home after midnight shifts. The bills stacked on kitchen counters beside prescription bottles. The voices that taught her survival mattered more than dreaming. Then Naomi looked up. Across the ballroom, hanging above the grand staircase, she saw Evelyn Sinclair's portrait watching over the room with the same calm smile. And suddenly the fear loosened its grip. Naomi lowered her hands onto the keys. The first notes drifted softly through the ballroom, warm and aching and alive. Within seconds, the room transformed. People stopped checking phones. Waiters froze beside silver trays. One woman near the front quietly wiped tears from beneath her eyes before she even realized she was crying. Edward remained standing at the edge of the stage, completely motionless, his eyes reflecting the chandelier light while the music filled every empty corner of the mansion his grief had once locked shut. And as Naomi played, something extraordinary happened. Nobody in that room saw a Blackmaid anymore. They saw an artist. They saw truth. They saw the kind of beauty that survives even after life tries to bury it beneath exhaustion, loss, and silence. When the final note faded, the ballroom remained quiet for one long, breathtaking moment before the entire room slowly rose to its feet. But Naomi barely noticed the applause. Because standing beside the stage, Edward Sinclair was crying openly now, not from sadness this time, but from the overwhelming realization that the woman he almost threw out of his music room had given his home a soul again.